In this example, we're going to factor x squared plus 8x plus 12, but we're going to do it step by step to learn the process that we need to use. There are 5 separate questions that we want to think through as we factor any trinomial. The first step in this process is recognizing that we do have a 1x squared. The process we're going to use here only works if it's a single x squared at the front. If there's a coefficient other than 1 on that first term, on that x squared term, the process we're using here will not work. We would need to use a separate process. But knowing that it is a 1x squared, our attention will turn to the 8 and the 12. To be able to factor this, we need to find a pair of numbers, 2 numbers, whose product is 12 and whose sum is 8. Because we know from the foiling process, the first term of x squared came from the f. The 8 came from the o plus the I, and the 12 came from the L in the FOIL. As a more general way to state the questions that we're trying to answer, people will refer to this type of trinomial as an x squared plus bx plus c trinomial. And then they will ask the question, what multiplies to make c and adds to make b? That's the same thing we're asking here when we say what multiplies to make 12 and adds to make 8. So the 12 needs to be a product, while the 8 needs to be the sum of the o and the I. One of the things to note is that we begin by first looking at the product. The product is the more restrictive of the possibilities. There's a limited number of integers who will multiply to make 12, but there's an infinite number of integers that will add to make 8. So we're always going to begin with the product because that will give us some sort of limitation as to the numbers that we need to worry about. But keeping in mind, we're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to make 12 and add to make 8. One of the things we should know about these signs is, if 2 numbers multiply to make 12, their signs must be the same. The only way to get a positive 12 when you multiply is if your numbers have the same sign. So to answer the next question, because the product is positive, the numbers must have the same sign. Now that we know we're multiplying 2 numbers, now let's look at the sum. The fact that the 2 numbers add to make a positive 8, and we know they have to both be the same sign, there's no way to add 2 negative numbers to get a positive 8. So because the product tells us they have to be the same sign, and the sum is positive, this tells us both the numbers must be positive. It's important to note that the green statement, because the sum is positive, the signs must both be positive, is in part dependent on the original statement, that the signs had to be the same based on the product. So everything we're saying about the sum, both of them having to be positive, is dependent on the fact that the product told us they had to be the same sign. Based on this information, we will now create a table of factor pairs for the number 12. We're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to make 12 and add to make 8. So our table will have one column for the factor pairs of 12, and then there will be a separate column for the sum of those 2 factor pairs. First, we will go through and find all the things that multiply to make 12, keeping in mind that we're looking for integers, and based on what we know in the previous question, they must both be positive. So things that multiply to make 12, 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Now for each of those possibilities, we also need to consider their sum. 1 plus 12 is 13, 2 plus 6 is 8, 3 plus 4 is 7. Keeping in mind that we're trying to find a pair of numbers whose product is 12 and whose sum is 8, all the factor pairs we have picked do have a product of 12, but we're looking for that one pair that has the sum of 8. And that's the pair in the middle, 2 and 6. 2 times 6 is 12, 2 plus 6 is 8. So that is the answer to the next question. Which factor pair has the needed sum? 2 and 6. So now that we have the pair of numbers that we needed, we can now start to factor. So we'll begin first by writing down the original trinomial, x squared plus 8x plus 12. If this is going to factor, it's going to factor as 2 binomials. We know, because the first term is an x squared, that x squared is again coming from the f in the FOIL, the first terms. So that tells us the only way to get an x squared in the front of the trinomial is if we had multiplied x times x. Now to fill in the second part of each binomial, that's where all the other work that we've just done comes in. We needed a pair of numbers that when we did the outside and the inside, they would add to make 8, and we multiplied the last terms, they would multiply to make 12. Well, the 2 numbers that we came up with were a positive 2 and a positive 6. So we'll write that as a plus 2 and a plus 6. So x squared plus 8x plus 12 will factor as the quantity x plus 2 times the quantity x plus 6. It is highly encouraged that you do check your work, especially in the beginning. If you are going to check your work though, make sure there is a clear separation between the factoring you're doing and the FOILing we're about to do to check our work. So to check, I'm going to multiply x plus 2 times the quantity x plus 6. When I do the first, I get an x squared. When I do the outside, I get a plus 6x. When I do the inside, I get a plus 2x. And when I do the last terms, 2 times 6 is 12. If we go ahead and simplify this one step further, x squared plus 6x plus 2x plus 12 gives us x squared plus 8x plus 12. And so it does check out.